Okay, so, you sent us some stuff from Plato
Mm-hmm.
and, Gorgias, to be exact.
Right.
Specifically, part 3, as it appears in Rhetorical Tradition. I mean, that's a pretty dense book, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to do a deep dive into this, look at Socrates and what he was getting at with rhetoric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how it ties into, what we desire, what we end up doing, the choices that we make, and then some even bigger ideas, like how to be a good citizen,
Yeah.
good and evil,
Right.
like a whole nature of persuasion and how it works on us. Ready to jump in.
Yeah, let's unpack it. I mean, right away, what I find fascinating is how Socrates approaches this whole thing. He doesn't just come out and define rhetoric,
Yeah.
He starts off by asking Paulus this really fundamental question. He's like, okay, when people do things,
Yeah.
are they just trying to do that thing? Or is there like a deeper reason behind it? What's the real object or aim they're going for?
Right. And it's such a simple question, but it makes you think. Right. Like he uses this great example of taking medicine. You don't actually want to swallow some awful tasting goop that makes you feel even worse for a while, do you?
No.
The thing you really want is to get healthy.
Right. Exactly. It's not just the immediate action, but the ultimate goal. The thing that's driving us.
Yeah, the why behind the what.
Exactly. And that's where this gets really interesting because that simple question kind of sets the stage for this whole exploration of what motivates people and then how rhetoric tries to tap into that.
It's like, how do you convince someone to do something? Do you focus on the action itself or do you focus on what they really want deep down?
Right. And if we follow Socrates' thinking here, this whole idea of desire and the purpose of our actions, well, it kind of naturally leads us to this relationship between what we want, the steps we take, and ultimately the choices we make. And this becomes even more important when, someone's trying to persuade us of something.
Okay, so persuasion is key.
Yeah. And the source material we're looking at here, it kind of hints that maybe rhetoric's role is bigger than just being persuasive.
Like it could be a tool for philosophy.
Yeah, or even something as foundational as how we function as a society, like being a good citizen.
Oh, interesting.
Citizenship, yeah.
Exactly. And the material you shared, it reminds us that ancient Greece, which really shaped a lot of our ideas about government and society, they really emphasized spoken language, right? Public speaking, debates, but also written communication, as we see in Plato's dialogue.
Yeah, right.
And this idea emerges that rhetoric within that tradition could be like a way to help people live together better.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're living in a society, you're going to have different viewpoints, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to find some common ground and rhetoric. I mean, being able to communicate clearly and persuade people, that seems pretty important for that. Oh, it's essential. And the source even mentions how we tend to look for certain qualities in what we consider good citizens. And rhetoric, by appealing to our emotions, what they call pathos, it can convince people that someone has those qualities,
right?
Whether they actually do or not.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the power of rhetoric, but also, kind of the dangers of it.
Exactly. And the source material also brings up this concept of choices we make as members of a community, right? Both active choices and passive ones.
Okay.
Like think about voting. Actually going to the polls, that's an active choice.
Right.
But choosing not to vote, well, that's a choice too.
It is.
And both of those, they send a message, don't they?
Totally. Whether we're actively engaged or not, people are going to form opinions about us based on those choices.
Exactly. And it really highlights how rhetoric is at play, even in the everyday stuff of just, trying to live together, figuring out where we agree, where we disagree. Now, building on that idea of choice, the conversation in Gorgias kind of shifts to Socrates talking about wish, which he equates with choice.
Right.
And how it connects to good as this driving force. Yeah. His argument is basically that we desire what we believe is good and avoid what we believe is bad.
Okay, that makes sense. But the source points out something really interesting here.
Yeah.
In real life, things aren't always so black and white.
Right.
There's this big gray area. And that's where rhetoric, the art of persuasion, becomes so powerful. It can sway us in situations where it's not so obvious what's good and what's bad.
Absolutely. And to illustrate that, Socrates gives this example. He talks about someone, maybe a leader with a lot of power, or maybe a really skilled speaker who inflicts harm, like death, exile, taking away property.
Yeah.
And they do it because they genuinely believe it's for the greater good, even if other people disagree.
So they're making a decision that seems harmful.
Yeah.
But it's motivated by what they see as good. Even if the actions themselves, to everyone else, seem like objectively bad.
It's like the power of persuasion, either their own internal conviction
Right.
or their ability to persuade others overrides just acting on a gut feeling of what's right and wrong.
It becomes a choice shaped by persuasion, basically.
Exactly. And this leads to another fascinating, although brief, exchange between Socrates and Polus.
Okay.
He asks, is it worse to do wrong or to suffer wrong?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Right. And Polus, he doesn't even hesitate. He's like, suffering wrong is way worse.
Well, yeah, I mean, nobody wants to be heard, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's just human nature to want to avoid suffering.
Right. But then Socrates pushes further. He's like, but is doing wrong also more evil?
Mm.
And Polus is like, not at all.
So he's separating the experience of pain or harm from the idea of moral wrongdoing.
Exactly. Socrates is starting to make this distinction between what feels bad in the moment, suffering, and what's truly wrong on a deeper level, evil or foul. And Polus doesn't see them the same way. He's suggesting that what's fair and good and what's evil and foul, they're not necessarily the same thing.
And the source material kind of reminds us that even though these dialogues can be pretty hard to follow, these little back and forth parts are like signposts. They help us keep track of the main ideas.
Absolutely. It's like a quick save point in a video game, as the source puts it.
Oh, I like that. Okay, so we've saved our progress. Now what?
Right, exactly. We've reinforced our understanding. And now Socrates, he goes on, and he uses this deductive reasoning to argue his point that doing wrong is morally worse, more foul than suffering wrong, even if it doesn't necessarily feel worse. Think of it like this. He starts with a general principle: it's worse to be unjust than to be treated unjustly.
Okay.
And then he applies that to the specific case of doing wrong versus suffering wrong. And he deduces that doing wrong is more damaging to your character, and therefore it's worse in a more fundamental way.
And is that it? Is that his whole argument?
Well, the source makes a good point. It says no single argument can address every counter-argument or every important point. So, those who use rhetoric always have to make choices about what to focus on and what to leave out.
That's true.
And this leads to another insightful thing Socrates says. If someone does something, something else has to be acted upon. There's this inherent relationship between the actor and the thing being acted on.
Okay, so like a cause and effect type thing?
Yeah, kind of. And the source draws this really interesting parallel to what we call the rhetorical situation today.
Oh, okay.
It links Socrates' idea to Kenneth Burke's concepts of agent and agency.
Right.
So the rhetor, the one doing the persuading, and the means they use to act on the audience or situation. So we see how this ancient philosophical discussion is laying some groundwork for how we understand persuasion today.
It's like a company launching a new product.
Mm-hmm.
They're the agent, and they use a specific ad campaign, that's their agency, to influence consumers, the people being acted upon.
Exactly. And it all happens within a specific market or situation.
Okay, right.
So now the focus kind of shifts to a new person in the dialogue, Callicles. And Socrates isn't super complimentary about Callicles as a rhetor. He almost makes him look like an intellectual sidekick.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It seems like Socrates sees him as someone easily swayed who doesn't have the same rigor in his arguments. The source even suggests that Socrates maybe tolerates him more than he respects him as an equal.
So maybe this connects to that whole negative view of sophists back then.
Right. Exactly. It's possible. But Callicles, he does have some moments of insight. He points out what he sees as a flaw in Socrates' method.
Oh.
He notices how Socrates seems to switch between talking about things based on convention, like what society generally agrees on,
right, and
nature, a more fundamental truth. And Callicles suggests that Socrates does this to his own advantage in the argument.
Wow. So sidekick's not so dumb after all.
Right. He's got some sharp observations, and then he tries to bring in some big guns to support his argument. He quotes the poet Pindar.
Oh, okay. Name dropping.
Exactly. He's using the authority of this respected figure, which is, a classic rhetorical strategy.
Sure.
But then he falters. He can't remember the exact lines of the poem.
Oh, no.
And in a society where a lot of knowledge was passed down orally,
Right.
and memorization was, like, super important, that would have been a big blunder.
Yeah, it makes him look a little unprepared.
Oh, right. And it kind of reinforces that image of him as not quite as skilled in rhetoric as Socrates. He's got those flashes of insight, but then he trips up.
Right.
He also takes a little dig at Socrates, saying he doesn't approve of old guys who keep on philosophizing.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's a really dynamic exchange.
Yeah.
It shows how, even back then, debates could get pretty heated. You've got Socrates, the sharp thinker, and Callicles, who's clever, but maybe not quite on the same level.
Well, we've certainly gone down a deep rabbit hole with these excerpts from Plato's Gorgias today.
Yeah.
We've seen Socrates really wrestling with what rhetoric is all about, you know, how it ties into our desires, the choices we make, both as individuals and as citizens, and even how we understand right and wrong. It makes you really think about what's motivating people's actions and how much persuasion shapes our views of good and bad.
Yeah, it really does. And it raises an important question for everyone listening. You know, if rhetoric is so connected to our sense of good and how we function in a society, what responsibility do we have as people being persuaded and as people who might unintentionally persuade others? You know, is it enough to just be convinced by a message, or do we need to dig deeper and try to understand the real purpose behind it?
It's like Socrates in that medicine example.
Exactly. Don't just focus on the bitter taste.
Right.
Think about why you're taking it in the first place. What's the real goal you're after?
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And until next time, keep thinking.